Okay, y'all, I'm back. Another late night. Unfortunately, I lost. So the next 45 minutes, I may not be as into it as much because I pretty much just recorded it yesterday, hit pause in between and lost it. So I'm not too happy about that right now. So this next 45 minutes, it's about to start cooking up and getting good, but I actually put in some good work, good commentary. That's unfortunate I lost. Not liking this shirt. May switch out into a black one. But let's get it cooking. Let's get going.
Will not, I'm certain, show the mathematics. I have not had access to those records, even though I've tried to get them. There are ways of keeping people from getting them, even though it's declassified. I'm speaking of the current time. Going back to that time, the power was quite excessive, and Tesla knew it. But I might add that in terms of the knowledge of the effects of electric and magnetic fields on the human body and the human nervous system, there was little or nothing known at that time of those effects. We're dealing at a time where the only high-power transmissions were radio. There was no television except to its earliest phases, not as we know it today. And they had no medical knowledge to indicate at what point the human nervous system will break down, fry, or break apart completely due to the exposure to electromagnetic energy. The magnetic field component is, in terms of a DC field, not damaging. In terms of an AC field, can be extremely damaging. Tesla was the only one who had a real feeling for the dangers involved. And he kept saying to everyone, to Duncan, to myself, and other people, we're going to have a problem. He says, I'm not sure whether we can run this equipment safely without affecting the safety or the welfare, or perhaps even the lives of the sailors who may be near it. So we went back to the Navy. They already had signed a test date in March of 1942.
So right here, this is the first time we're seeing that. This is the first time we're seeing that Al Bielek, this relation to Tesla. Why is Tesla important? We're seeing that he keeps on saying to me, I think these are the ways I see like he's telling the truth. He's not even trying to emphasize, oh, I knew Tesla, but he's just talking. He's saying to me, he's just talking about his life and that he remembers. He's saying to me that me and my brother, who was what he pretty much said, Duncan's his brother, he's like, we're going to have problems. So you're seeing that he works side by side as a scientist with Tesla. Let's keep going.
And he said, I need more time to look at this and to find a solution to the problem, which I know is going to develop. So we may wind up with dead sailors. And I certainly don't want that to happen. And I have to redesign this equipment and do other things. And the Navy came back to him and says, so Tesla, do what you have to do, but there's a war on. The date is firm. You will have to meet that test date. So the date rolls around. Equipment's turned on. The night before, Tesla went around and apparently sabotaged a few pieces of equipment so they wouldn't work. Net result was what did turn on produced a few sparks and no invisibility field, no heavy radiated field of either RF or magnetic fields. No one was hurt. No test results, of course. The Tesla bowed out and says, gentlemen, this test is a failure. I have other things to do. There's a very good man who can take over. That was Dr. John von Neumann. He recommended Dr. John von Neumann, who was assigned the task of being the director. So what does Dr. von Neumann do? He says, well, to the Navy, I have to find out what went wrong. Very obvious question, very obvious answer, and a very obvious statement. It didn't take him long to find out what went wrong, the fact that the equipment had been sabotaged.
So this is the first time we're going to hear about Dr. John von Neumann, John von Neumann, who Al Bielek is going to talk about as a genius in his own respects. He's even going to go on to say, maybe now or a little bit later, that, Einstein, I'm going to change this lighting because y'all can't see me. I'll come back and try. Einstein, I wanted to get it rolling, y'all, because I'm trying to get to 45. I just watched this yesterday. So basically, John von Neumann becomes the leader of this project over the next 40 years. And he becomes instrumental in Al Bielek's life in recovering his identity as Al Bielek, as from Duncan Cameron to James Cameron. He ends up making him a promise down the road saying, if you ever remember your identity beyond Al Bielek, that you were actually Ed Cameron or James Cameron, I'll be there for you. So this guy's like a father figure to him, but he also heralds him in high respect, saying like, hey, Einstein's one thing in you all's history books, but Einstein's theoretical. He can't do nothing with his hands. This guy knows how to apply his knowledge and math to the field, actually, to practicality. And he goes on to talk about how von Neumann, I think he's about to do it now, where he learned his math from and certain things like that. They don't even use the same math. You know, I was talking to a PhD one day about a PhD guy who worked on machines, everything, and I told him that cloning was real. Cloning was a thing of the past that Hitler had done. And he was like, he was out of his feelings. Like, what? That's not possible. You can't, no, that's not possible. I was like, I'm sorry, y'all. I'm sorry. He'd never seen this video. He'd never seen stuff like that. I was like, the math you learned isn't the same math that they have. Al Bielek's going to talk about that, how the governments are 100 years ahead of the people in terms of math, and they recovered math from aliens, things of that sort. I'm let him tell you.
But he decided he wanted to redesign the whole system. Now, it does not mean that he wanted to take a totally different mathematical approach, because the mathematical approach was correct as we were using it in those days. He decided that he wanted to scrap the analog system, which Tesla was using. By analog, I mean very much like current radio. You have an RF carrier that is modulated with the voice or music, and it's a continuous modulation. It's not digital. There's a continuous modulation of varying amplitudes. In case of frequency modulation, the amplitude is constant, but you, shall we say, cause a deviation or a variation in frequency in accordance with the modulation that you want to impress on it. But it is continuous. Now, the idea which von Neumann had, and which he wished to do, and he did do, was that instead of it being continuous radiation, it would be pulsed at about a 10% duty cycle. And this meant he was going to pulse not only the magnetic fields, but he was going to pulse the RF fields, more efficient in his view. Now, Neumann was a strange man, I might add. He was not only a very good theoretician mathematically, he was one of those very rare breed who could convert it to engineering hardware and design the hardware himself. Very few people had that capability. You think of mathematicians like Hilbert, like many others in history, Einstein probably couldn't tell you which end of a wrench to hold. When it came to mathematical equations, he had little or no peer. Von Neumann was probably equally as capable in some areas of mathematics, but he had the additional expertise of being a good engineer. He decided it had to be a pulse system, and he needed much time to redesign. He also decided that, unlike trying to lash equipment on the decks of a battleship, he wanted a ship from the ground up, designed for the project. So we went to the Newark shipbuilding yards, not too far away, and took a number off the drawing board, DE-173, and decided that this is what I want done. The Navy concurred, told the builders, we're going to change the design slightly here. We want number 2 gun turret left unfinished. We want a quite large area in the hold of the ship, which is left open. We're not going to have all of the usual compartments. Of course, the main machinery had to be functional. The ship had to be able to go to sea. Excuse me. And you will build the ship this way, run it down the ways with the unfinished section in the interior on the unfinished gun turret number 2. But you can provide a dummy gun turret if you wish to cover up the hole. In fact, if it's going to go to sea, you'll have to. Well, that ship was on the ways in the summer of 42, and I'm talking about DE-173. The official Navy record shows, if you care to look it up, that it was commissioned in August 27th, 1943, and it went down the ways about 2 months before that. And it was in construction in 1943, not 1942. I'm speaking, of course, of the official record. The Navy does not, and never has denied the existence of DE-173. It has only denied the much earlier date of launch and of its use in the Philadelphia experiment. To this day, they insist there never was a Philadelphia experiment. Well, I've got news for them. There was, and I was there. As were. Let me give you a picture of, shall we say, what our daily work was like. We reported in every day. We didn't live on the base. Duncan and I. We reported in every day, typically around 7 in the morning, through the main gate. It was interesting to note, and anybody can check the old maps on this, there's an old trolley line that may to this day be running on Broad Street, which went right through downtown Philadelphia and straight and directly to the Navy base. In fact, at one point it ran on the base, but they cut it off eventually right at the entrance, or the entrance gate, and you walked from there. Direct trolley line, no problems getting back and forth. And we lived off base. And of course, actually, we shuttled back and forth between the Institute and the Philadelphia Navy Yard. We'd come in the morning and go to work. And our job there in the yard was really more supervisory than anything. We were not involved in design. We were not actually part of building equipment or moving equipment on board. We were supervisory. But we had to know everything that was happening. We had to know everything that was being done. And watch, literally, the equipment that was installed. After the Eldridge was actually launched in September of 1942, I was transferred to the Philadelphia Navy Yard, and the finishing work was done on the ship there in the Navy Yard. And this, of course, included, as time went on, the installation of some very heavy equipment on board the ship. The ship's power was totally inadequate to supplying the power necessary for these tests because we were using megawatts of power as equipment was designed. We had an 8 megawatt diesel electric generator, which was the biggest piece of equipment to be moved in the hold. That took a lot of work. Then there was a pair of alternators, 75 kVA each, with a huge motor drive system and gearboxes. They had to be rolled and bolted into place very securely. And then some additional work was done by another man I've talked with since, is Al Bielek, because he is still alive, last I heard, and he designed the synchronizing equipment, which became a real problem because Neumann knew, and without going into the specifics of the theory, the two alternators had to be electrically synchronized in an exact phase relationship. Mm. And that could not be done mechanically. It was tried, but it was a totally hopeless task because you're dealing with huge gearboxes and 75 horsepower motor, and all of the adjacent gearboxes and other systems, and there was always mechanical slop. Finally, it had to be done as an electrical synchronization directly between the two alternators. That was accomplished. It took a lot of work. Like so many other pieces of equipment on board that ship, you put them in, you test a particular system, a particular piece of equipment. There were all kinds of failures, all kinds of frustrations, and everybody took it out, their frustrations, that is, typically that night in one of the downtown bars in Philadelphia. The Blue Lagoon, to be specific. That bar was mentioned in the movie, the commercial movie of the Philadelphia Experiment, titled The Philadelphia Experiment, produced in 1984, but they never mentioned the name of the bar. The scenario they showed in there was essentially correct. The bar, in fact, existed far beyond the period of 1943. It was finally shut down, I understand, about 1993, which is quite a few years. As I remember it, and Duncan remembers it, because we usually went together, unless we were on dates or something. We go down there and have a beer or two or three with the boys, and that is the sailors who were non-coms or had no rating, whatever. It was rather an interesting group because we stuck rather closely together. We had to for a reason. We were all under orders not to talk about the experiment. Now, people would ask us in those days, what are you doing? You're in the yard? Yes. What are you doing? Well, we're working on a project. Well, what are you working on? Well, we couldn't talk about it. And we beat around the bush, and occasionally there was a little leakage and reprimands. But basically, people kept their mouths shut. Yes, said we were working on a war project. That was the password at those times. Nobody asked much more. So time went on, became very familiar with the bar. And of course, the night before the final test, there was a sort of farewell party. And I say the final test of the Eldridge. Actually, I'm talking about test number 2. Even before test number 1 for the Eldridge, there was a sort of going away party. But the whole process of getting the equipment ready took months and months and months. It went on from December, when they took the Eldridge out of dry dock finally, where they put in the very heavy equipment and did the finishing work on the ship, which was December of 42, and put it in the back section of the Navy Yard where all of the other equipments were put on, and there were subsection tests and various pieces of equipment were tested. The radio communication system was tested. And they made their final assignments of personnel. And the crew, I might add, was a specially selected volunteer crew. Now that gets to another interesting part of the history. Before I go into that, I just want to say that with all of the frustration of all of these tests, we finally decided the ship was ready for testing. And Von Neumann conceded it was ready for testing sometime in early July of 1943. And this test, the first one, was conducted on 22 July 43, about 6 miles downriver from the yard itself in the river. Not where it became already the bay, the Delaware Bay. It was up near actually part of the city, at an island called Tinicum Island. They did not drop anchor. This, of course, was not to be done because nobody knew what would happen to these fields if you dropped anchor. It might short them out. So no anchor was dropped, was put on station, became stationary, and equipment was turned on. The results I will describe shortly. But that only came on 22 July. There was a lot of grief and work to be done in the interim. When we were all satisfied it would work, and Tesla said long since, you're going to have problems with the high power, Von Neumann agreed eventually, with a lot of argumentation between Duncan, myself, and Von Neumann. Tesla said so, and he'd want to hear this, but eventually he agreed there is a possibility, because we were dealing with some rather high powers. Now, what kind of power were we dealing with? Von Neumann decided to up the power output of the RF transmitters from the original 0.5 megawatt design to each antenna to a 2 megawatt design, and this is operating at 160 megahertz. Now, some people may feel that frequency was impossible in those days with the kind of power we're using. Never forget the fact that military electronics and government electronic systems are always years, decades typically ahead of the civilian sector. Now, in the period of time of then, let's say a more reasonable statement would be perhaps 30 years ahead. Today, the secret electronics and other systems which our government has are probably anywhere from 50 to 100 years ahead of what the civilian population knows, and the commercial population and the commercial usage knows. But we were ahead. We had the capability of producing that kind of power, obviously, for military usage and for the government. The various manufacturing companies will produce equipment on special order, which is not for commercial usage. The theory is there, it's just a matter of can you build it? Well, if they say we offer you this amount of money, get it built, they do it. And there was no limit because the war was already on. There was no limit on the money that was expended to just get the job done.
Got to win the war.
And why were they so anxious to get it done? Well, historically, for those who are not aware of it today, in this era, when the war started, the Germans had huge fleets of submarines. They were very effective at sinking shipping. In fact, they were so effective, they almost cut England off from food. They sank every other piece of shipping coming across the Atlantic or from wherever heading to England. Up until December 7th, 1941, of course, the U.S. was not involved, and U.S. shipping was theoretically immune from being sunk. Comes December 7th, with the attack in Pearl Harbor, we were part of the war, and of course, we were just as vulnerable as anyone else. With 50% of the shipping going down in the Atlantic, it was quite a problem. They wanted, of course, to reduce this as much as possible and get shipping, munitions, food, whatever, through to England. And the idea of the whole basic concept of invisibility was that if you can make the ship invisible to radar, the Germans had good radar. They won't be able to find the convoys and the ships and the fleet except by day, and if the ships, the submarines, are seen by day, there are means of taking care of them. If they're on the surface or even have a periscope up, they can spot them. And torpedoes or whatever will take care of them. If the convoy is invisible to radar, they're not even going to be able to find the general location by radar, and they'll probably miss most of the convoys. That was the hope, and that was the idea, and why so much time and money was spent on the Project Invisibility. In the background, but just a little bit after this, not concurrent, was another major war effort, of course, the atomic bomb. That work started about 1942. The theory, of course, was laid down much earlier. But the work on that was totally separate and began in Los Alamos laboratories in 1943. I will go into that in a little later because I was part of that. The concern was, how do you stop these Wolfpack fleets from being so effective? Invisibility seemed to be the answer if it worked properly. So with all of the work and the effort and having our little farewell party on the night of July 21, the test crew was on the Eldridge, was taken downriver, and on the orders from the observer ship and the man who was in charge of this whole test for the Navy, let's say the official coordinator running all these tests, was a man by the name of Captain Harrison. Harrison was a very interesting man in his own way. He was the first Native American to achieve the rank of captain in the U.S. Navy. And it was sort of an honor for him to do this. I know this because I know his son, who's currently alive today. And he was in charge of the tests. Well, of course, on this carrier, which was used for the observing of the tests, they wanted to be high enough above the water so that it was very easy to see what was going on through binoculars. And also see the other very important aspect of this test is it wasn't just the ship that became invisible. This donut field was surrounding the ship but did not impinge on the hull of the ship. It was a little bit outside of it. As a result of this, water also became invisible. There was a water line around the ship, which showed essentially the outline of where the ship would be, except the water line was a little larger than the ship. So from the observing ship high enough up, you could see what this water line was and tell where the ship was. Hopefully it was really there. It was, in fact. And observe this. Well, Harrison looked at this, and after about 20 minutes of the test, he could see that something did not appear to be quite correct, and something in his mind bugged him. Namely, if the ship is sitting there invisible, and we can't see the water under the ship and so forth, is the ship really in water or is it in air? This is what bothered him. It says terminate the tests after 20 minutes. And they were terminated. The ship became visible. It was totally invisible to sight, not to radar, which they did test for, because 43 already had good radar systems. Told to return to the yard, which it did, back in the back section, and then we knew there was a problem, because all those sailors were deliberately stationed on deck to be observers of what they could see from inside, i.e., could you see anything outside the ship? No, nothing. Gray field, gray fog, thick gray impenetrable fog, but everything on board the ship appeared to be normal, within the purview of up to the rail. But those who were on the decks became very sick, very nauseous, totally out of it mentally. They weren't injured physically, but they were totally, shall we say, incapacitated mentally. So Von Neumann sees this when they get back and says to the Navy, we got a problem. I've got to find some solution to this. The Navy says, not to worry, we have another test crew for you. About half of the volunteer crew was used on the first test, and the second half was used on the second test. To get into that aspect of the volunteer crew, where did this come from and how did this occur? So I mentioned previously my father, who left the Navy in December of 1929, unbeknownst to us at that time, was not only building racing sloops in Long Island and putting them in the racing regattas, but he was also, as I already mentioned, bringing some German scientists out of Germany. Why was he doing this? What were his connections? What else was going on? It took many, many years, long after I was no longer at Cameron, when I was Al Bielek, to find the answers to what Father was really doing and what he was involved in. That I'll get into later, other than to say at this point that he was doing many things we weren't quite aware of. Now, what is of record in that period was that when the war started, the Coast Guard tapped him on the shoulder and asked him if he would give volunteer service to the Coast Guard. He did. There are pictures of him in his Coast Guard uniform at the age of 50. He's still a very good-looking man. And he became literally the man who is the, shall we say, the schoolmaster for the special volunteer crew. The Navy went, as von Neumann wanted, not only a special ship, he wanted a volunteer crew, which the Navy agreed was a very good idea because nobody knew what might really happen. And Tesla let it be known that some things might happen. He went throughout the whole Navy and asked for volunteers for a very special project. These were the requirements. You had to have at least a normal IQ, you had to be in good health, and so forth. And if you volunteered, you would be taken out of your present billet and be put on some other special project. You go through a special school and all of this. They got a number of volunteers and eventually selected and settled on some 33. He went through a special training class between September and December of 1942 at one of the Coast Guard facilities in Connecticut. And Father was the one who briefed them. And I have in my collection a picture of this test crew. And it's very interesting because they were in a gymnasium when they took the picture. In the middle, on the seated in the first row, was my father.
Hey.
This became the backbone. They, of course, when they finished their schooling in December of 42, they became the backbone of the crew, the enlisted crew for the tests. There were, of course, some officers in addition. These people stood by, quite literally, in the Philadelphia Navy Yard during the period from January of 43 until...
Hey, y'all, I'm back. These times are more important than ever to get this information out. Therefore, but it's already out. It's on Channel 3X, but I kind of want to just, add to it, make sure I get to back up everything. This is so important. I'm surprised it's even still on YouTube, to be honest. So, basically getting the info out. And let's go. Let's continue. You'll see me here in a second. I'll be back here in a second.
When they finished their schooling in December of 42, they became the backbone of the crew, the enlisted crew for the tests. There were, of course, some officers in addition. These people stood by, quite literally, in the Philadelphia Navy Yard during the period from January of 43 until they were required on the Eldridge, with some training on board ship, of course. And then, of course, we had the first test on July 22nd, 1943. To the radar systems, the ship was them. And I have in my collection a picture of this test crew. And it's very interesting because they were in a gymnasium when they took the picture. In the middle, on the seated in the first row, was my father. This became the backbone. They, of course, when they finished their schooling in December of 42, they became the backbone of the crew, the enlisted crew for the tests. There were, of course, some officers in addition. These people stood by, quite literally, in the Philadelphia Navy Yard during the period from January of 43 until they were required on the Eldridge, with some training on board ship, of course. And then, of course, we had the first test on July 22nd, 1943. To the radar systems, the ship was invisible. To those optically viewing it, the ship was invisible. It just faded out, if you will. According to what I was told, not being on the outside, but on the inside with Duncan running the equipment, it just sort of faded out from view like some of the modern fade-out montages they do on television and in the movies, which they're expert at creating these effects now. But this was a real effect, not an illusion. It was illusion in the sense that you couldn't see the ship anymore, but it was very much there. But it had a price, and the price was what happened to the crew on deck. Those below deck were shielded by the steel and not affected. So von Neumann looks at this as, we got to solve this problem. He went to the Navy and says, I need time to solve it. The Navy didn't give him an answer at first. Finally, they came back to him about August 1 and said, you have a drop-dead date. You complete these tests by 12 August 1943 or forget it. Now, this was very unusual because von Neumann didn't understand this. Duncan and I didn't understand it. I went to Hal Bourne Sr., who was still available, director of the Office of Naval Engineering. We had some friendship with him. and asked him, what is this all about? He says, well, I got the order. It comes from upstairs, and they says, I'll look into it. And they came back in a rather short time. It says this originated with Admiral King, who at that point was the Chief of Naval Operations worldwide. Now, what is a man, as I asked, and Al Bourne couldn't understand it, why is a Navy admiral running all of the Navy's affairs in the war out of Washington concerned about a date on an engineering test and having it end on 12 August or be completed by 12 August or, quote, forget it, unquote. We didn't understand this, and frankly, we never got the answer to what this was all about till quite literally the late 1980s. No longer I was like Ed Cameron. Physically, I am, but my identity today is Al Bielek. And with a lot of research, we did find the answer, but I'll not get into that at this point. That is quite a bit of explaining as to what that was really all about. Von Neumann didn't understand it. Nobody did, but we had the date. We had to live with it. So it was around the clock. And the Navy did say, oh, yes, one other little point. We're not concerned about optical invisibility, only radar invisibility. If this helps, that's fine. The reasoning at that time was, at night in a convoy, you better be able to see the ship in some manner or other, optically, by eyesight, because you had no satellites at this point, no low-end, no shore-end, no long-range navigation. All we had is by the seat of your pants and by sight and by radar. And if the radar invisibility was in effect, then of course you're not going to see anyone else in the fleet by radar. And of course, the Germans hopefully would never find the fleet or the entire convoy either. So that was a slight relaxation. It really didn't make any difference in the equipment. Just a matter of how much power was involved and how finely tuned it was. So we went along with this, and by 9 August of 1943, just about everybody involved with the test in terms of being on shipboard was getting this funny, queasy feeling in the pit of their stomach. Like we all knew something was wrong.
Intuition.
That funny feeling that you get, something isn't right, we had it strong. Nobody knew why. Nobody knew what was wrong. Nobody had any concept that there was anything wrong. Duncan had it. I had it. Most of the crew members had it. And one very interesting young man who was a sailor who came from Bozeman, Montana, Bill Cody, an enlisted man, who was in the picture. I was able to identify him finally. He was in the picture of the graduating class. He was particularly ill. And that night, on the 9th of August, he was quite sensitive and quite ill to the effects of the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He was totally beside himself. He was agitated. I said, let's go out and have some coffee. Well, we went out the back door of the Navy Yard, and about a quarter of a mile down the line was a diner. And we went there, and we stayed there for the night and came back, and he felt a little better. A lot of sailors went there because it was a 24-hour diner. We'll get into this later because it's historically very important. Comes the 12th of August, of course. We all get on the ship. We have our, shall we say, our final party the night before, going into the wee morning hours at the good old Blue Lagoon. And we arrive and we get on board the ship and take our positions. The ship goes down the harbor to the point of test. Now we have 3 observer ships. We have the carrier, we have the Navy Coast Guard ship, and we have a commercial merchant ship known as the SS Freyaseth, on which was stationed a man who was at a later date called Carlos Miguel Landa. That was not his true name. His real name, well known then, was Carl Allen. He was an officer in the Navy and also had a PhD in physics. But that was the lineup. We were set for the test. And of course, at the appropriate hour, everything was turned on by a radio link. We turned on the equipment, and of course, the ship became radar invisible, but it was not optically invisible. You could still see an outline of the ship through what was a green haze, a green fog. This green fog, actually, in technical terms, is highly agitated ionized oxygen, or ozone, generated by the various pieces of electrical equipment operating, particularly the RF generators, the RF field generated by the antenna, and certain other equipments. We're producing this greenish fog. That identified where the ship was, and you could see it, and the same large water outline. But then there was a blue flash. After about 70 seconds, blue flash of light, and the ship disappeared, the waterline disappeared, and there was no eldritch. no communication. And this condition, with everybody on board the Eldridge, knowing nothing about what has happened, I will get into that very briefly, but everyone on the carrier, on the observer ships, had no idea what was wrong and had no concept of what was going on or happened until the Eldridge returned 4 hours later in the same point in the harbor.
Okay, so this is going to go on to the tape 2 that they have. Autobiography. You can get right into it.
While the crew of the Eldridge is in limbo, shall we say, for 4 hours, I want to interject a few pictures, which I think are appropriate to put in at this point. On the left side is a blow-up myself, Edward Cameron, taken in 1936 in the yearbook of 1936 for Princeton University. You will note perhaps that it says 8 Cameron. Someone forgot to put the Edward in, perhaps because of that. It remained in the yearbook and was not removed like my brother's was from the University of Edinburgh yearbook. We did track that down. The page was there, but the picture was missing. The other person on this side where my fingers are is my father. Father in his Navy uniform in 1917. Yeoman, first class. As I said, nothing about when he enlisted. We can find no matter any records whatever of him, other than the final days when he was released from the service with a medical discharge. We don't even have a copy of that, but it's in the archives in Bayshore, Long Island. Now, we go over to the next page, or pages. Again, the one on the side over here, there's father at the age of 50 in his Coast Guard uniform. Volunteer service in World War II. But he hasn't changed very much in appearance. He's still a very good-looking man. And, of course, his only problem with women was there were too many. They kept chasing him. And we do not know how many children he sired. That's a lost fact of the family. They keep turning up.
Man lived a good life.
This one is the famous or infamous picture of the graduating crew for the test crew or crews for the Eldridge. Now, down seated in the middle in a Coast Guard uniform again is my father. None of the other people can I identify at this point except one, and that is the person seated directly above father in the bleachers. That was Bill, sometimes nicknamed Wild Bill Cody, one of those who died in the steel, face down on the deck. That, of course, is getting slightly ahead of myself on the story, but he was one of the many who died. These two pictures, this one first, was taken on board the Eldridge on the 9th of August, 1943, 3 days before the fatal test.
Pay attention, pay attention.
And was a final briefing for interested parties, scientists, and a few Navy people. Almost all of them on this picture were civilian. The man giving the lecture I do not currently have the name of, but he was a specialist in subatomic particle physics. He was from India, the continent of India. And it was his lecture. And all of the people there were listening to him. The man in the foreground on this side in the Navy uniform is Dr. Oscar O. Schneider, the MD, who is officially in charge of the medical aspects of the experiment. The man I'm pointing to is Oscar Schneider, is this one down here. And next to him, slightly over towards the middle, is a man that looks like he has graying hair. It's because of the black and white, it's not gray.
You want to say pay attention to?
It's a very strange individual by the name of Don Thor. He's holding a sheaf of papers in his hand, as you may note. He was a civilian, and we do not know all of his history except...
So I'm saying pay attention because he looks like what we see on reported YouTube videos, Val Venus from Venus, the alien that showed up from Venus that looked human like everyone else, worked with the government in I think in the 1950s. He came to Roosevelt. You can look him up on YouTube, Val Venus, Valvenus. Maybe we'll do some covering of him on here. Basically, they said this guy had garments that you could shoot bullets at, that it was silky, but the bullets would just would pop right off of him. And other things of that sort, crazy things. Spoke like 55 languages, and he appeared like one of us. He appeared like as a human being, and white guy, blonde hair, just like this. Now remember, we learned the law of one, that beings who are of the fifth density will appear to members on that planet as they are on the planet. They'll appear they'll look like the individual. And sorry guys, it's daytime. This is like the second time I've covered this. Actually, I lost it the first time I did it dark, and I like the nighttime vibe of Mr. Metaphysical more, and so I try to do things at night. But it's daytime, so it's getting to the point. Me seeing the U.S. getting involved, or Biden attacking using long-range missiles, authorizing Ukraine to use long-range missiles, as well as Putin responded that he's threatening to use a nuclear weapon against America. And this is what Al Bielek says happens in his autobiography in 2137. It's motivated me to get this out. Almost like, and I told you so, because I've been watching this slowly for this came out years ago. I saw this on YouTube 13 years ago. It's been on channel 3X the whole time, and I look and there's only 30. Now, it used to be there was only 20,000 subscribers. Now there's 36,000 worldwide. I'm like, man, this thing should have millions of people here. Instead, anyway. So I'm gonna keep on going. I think they say something about Val Venus, that being his potential brother. This is Don Thor we're looking at. I didn't know Val Venus came with a brother, but they said that was a reported brother of Val Venus that looked alike. So here we go. I thought it was Val Venus, actually.
It is alleged that he, as his brother Val, were from Venus. And why he had an interest in this experiment, we do not know to this day. Nor why he was there, we do not know to this day. Many other people, scientists, we cannot identify. In this picture, also included was Dr. Vannevar Bush, advisor to the president, and he's lost in the crowd in the background. The man I'm referring to as Vannevar Bush is the one right above my finger. Again, right below my fingers, Dr. Oscar Schneider in his captain's uniform for the United States Navy. He had a very strange history. The official Navy version says that Dr. Schneider was born in 1905 in Chico, California, went through U of C Berkeley, got his pre-med, went to Harvard for his medical school, took his internship, and then after he had completed his work and became an MD, he joined the Navy and went up through the ranks in the Navy and became eventually a captain of the United States Navy as a medical officer. The story which he told to his son, Phil Schneider, approximately 2 weeks before he died of cancer, was a bit different. Schneider's story, an official story, is that he was born in Germany before the days of the Nazis, went through school, was a master machinist at the age of 14, eventually enlisted in the German Navy, and worked his way up in the ranks, became a captain of the Navy of a submarine. And in the early stages of World War II, according to Mr. Schneider, or Captain Schneider, had 68 kills to his credit of ships sunk. Wolfpack fleets were very busy in those days. He was captured by the French approximately 1940. 39 or 40, I'm not sure when now from what it was told to me. Was held by the French for a number of time, and after the United States was involved with it, the Third Army was in France, and he was turned over to them. Some negotiations took place, and he wound up in the United States Navy with the same rank of captain as a medical officer. I do not know how this came about. Another Phil Schneider. He says suddenly he was an MD, and there was no indication from his father Oscar's statement that he ever went through medical school. It's also peculiarly of interest that of the notebooks of Oscar Schneider I've read, he had a very good grasp of mathematics, including time equations. I find that somewhat strange for a person who is alleged to be an MD. I've never known an MD that knew math.
Most likely came over.
And he certainly did. This may have been the real reason why he was brought into the United States to work on this project, because he was brought straight into it. And as a medical officer, of course, it was a good cover. Of course, there were other medical people around who probably could cover him if he got into difficulty. I never met the man after this whole sequence was over. I had an opportunity, but unfortunately I could not get to see him before he died. I have some other things I want to show, but I'll wait until after the story that I'm in the middle of has been completed, namely what happened to the Eldridge and the crew. The ship came back to the same spot from which it had left, and it was quite obvious from the observers on the deck of the carrier that something was very much wrong. First, they could not raise anyone on the radio. Secondly, through binoculars, they could see the special antenna on the top of the main mast. That is the one that was used for the project invisibility was broken. There was some other superficial damage visible on the ship. But the most important thing was that they saw sailors moving around on the deck, and they could get no response on the radio. A boarding party was told aboard the Eldridge what you did, and that is when they found the real extent of the damage. They found 2 sailors buried in the steel deck, dying. Their bodies were intermingled with the steel, and of course nobody could understand how that happened, not at that point. 2 more were found upright, buried in the steel bulkhead. One of them was our younger brother, Jim. We had a younger brother by the name of Jim, 6 years younger than Duncan.
And you'll see in a separate video on the channel 3X, Al Bielek talks about, seeing his younger brother dying, this one, and how he has to jump overboard with his brother, his other brother, Ed, because he's like, "Are you coming?" And they jump overboard, expecting to hit water. But they don't. This is his autobiography, but he doesn't. I don't know how much he goes into 2137 here in his future time travels.
He enlisted in the Navy in 1941 after Pearl Harbor, and one could say he drew the short straw and became part of that second fateful crew. And he was dying. This is what was observed. And one other man, a 5th man, had a hand up to his wrist buried in the steel bulkhead, and he lived. They cut his hand off, gave him an artificial one later. There were also found some other very strange activities. A number of sailors were running around on the deck, I should say, milling around rather crazily on the deck, totally disoriented, totally out of it, and to all intents and purposes could be considered as quite insane. They certainly were oblivious to their location, their whereabouts, and what was going on. And with all of this, of course, the radio communication from the boarding party, they put a second boarding party in to take the ship back up the harbor and back into the location of the back section of the Nord. And then, of course, after that was accomplished, and the sick ones and the dead were removed. The dead were removed complete with steel plates and buried complete with steel plates in this unmarked cemetery south of Arlington. The Navy, of course, during this period, the 4 days following, had a board of inquiry. Navy loves boards of inquiry. And, of course, they pulled up everybody possible. What happened? They wanted to find out, quite obviously. Several officers gave their testimony. I gave mine. They didn't believe me after I gave my testimony. John von Neumann gave some testimony, but he didn't really see what happened. And after all of this, John Neumann took me aside. I might add, Duncan, my brother, was missing. He was not there among those available to give some enlightenment as to what had happened. After all of this, and a decision made by the board some days later, they decided they wanted to do another test with the Eldridge, a 3rd test. There was a lot of destroyed equipment aboard the Eldridge at that time when it was returned to the harbor and when they took it in the back section of the Navy Yard. And they replaced it. Over a period of time, they removed it all. They had spare systems in storage because they expected everything to be fully operational and to be fully a success. About 10 sets of spare equipments, complete, were available. So they ripped out the damaged equipment, replaced it with some good working equipment, did some subsystem tests, and on some day late in October of 1943, they took the ship back down much further below where they had been in the wider part of the harbor at night, put it on station, removed all of the personnel, and ran all of the equipment, remote control on very long cables, something between 1,500 and 2,000 feet to an adjacent ship, where controls were set up. And this took quite a while to set this whole setup, to design it, build it, and get it in place. And with the return of the Eldridge from this late night test down the harbor in a very broad part of the bay, the ship returned. They found again burned out equipment on board the ship. That is the equipment related to the invisibility test. At that point, the Navy threw up their hands, decided to scrap the entire series of tests, returned the ship to the Navy Yard with orders to remove the heavy equipment and re-outfit it as a standard vessel of war, because they were very short of Navy ships at that time in the middle of the war in 1943. And they couldn't afford to leave one laid up someplace. So the ship was re-outfitted. The second gun turret was replaced with the wooden dummy with a real turret. And about 1 January of 1944, it went out to sea. And Sole War service through that period of 44, 5, and into 46. And 47, it was put in mothballs, not decommissioned, in storage along with many other Navy ships. In 1951, the Eldridge was taken out of mothballs along with a sister ship and given to the Greeks for whatever purposes. At the time, it was stated that they were giving these ships under the Lend-Lease program established by Harry Truman, then president. And it wasn't stated that they were under loan. It was merely stated that they were given to them under Lend-Lease. The Greeks kept the ship for many, many years. And one of the peculiarities of this whole thing that turned up was that the ship's log, required by maritime law to be started on the day of commissioning and be kept with the ship until it is decommissioned, must be complete. Now, when the ship is decommissioned, of course, the log can be given to somebody else, whoever might be an archivist or whatever the case may be. The Greeks inherited the ship, and they found that every page in the log prior to January 1, 1944 had been ripped out. Total violation of maritime law, but nevertheless, that was the way it was. So the Greeks could not establish anything as to what had happened to the Eldridge prior. The Eldridge remained with the Greeks for a rather long period of time, up until about 1995. And at that time, a period, I'm not really sure what they used it for, but it was used primarily as a training ship. It was left at dockside most of the time at a port in Greece. And the Navy then approaches the Greeks and say, we want the Eldridge back. But you gave it to us. Oh, no, we just loaned it to you. We want it back. So the Greeks had to clean it up, scrape the decks, do whatever preparations were required by the Navy. There are photos of this in preparation. They were appeared, strangely enough, in the Greek Playboy magazine, of which I have a copy in the photos. And before it was turned over back to the Navy, United States Navy, an individual who had been involved with the Eldridge back in the days when it was being outfitted for the Project Invisibility and knew the interior cabling and wiring and such, decided to go over and see if this Eldridge was the same one which he had known, which was part of the Philadelphia experiment. I've forgotten the name of the man who made this trip, but he did tell me. He went over there, looked at the Eldridge, went through it, and found out it was the same ship. He recognized the bundles of cabling, which had never been removed by the Navy, even though they were totally unnecessary for the normal functions of the ship and were literally an accessory. The Greeks didn't know what they were there for. They saw them, and they wondered about it, but of course did nothing about it. The Eldridge was towed across the Atlantic. It was not seaworthy at that point. The hull was in terrible shape. But they towed it across the Atlantic to the Norfolk, Virginia Navy Yard, overhauled it, gave it a new hull, cleaned it up, made a few changes, of course, took all of the strange old wiring out. And today, looking like a brand spanking new ship with the same number, DE-173, and the same name, the USS Eldridge, is now parked in Washington, D.C. Navy Yard at the dockside of the Office of Naval Research, their special facility. And it makes periodic trips up and down the Long Island Sound for unknown purposes. They would not scrap the ship. They rebuilt it completely. Rather strange. No reasons have ever been given by the Navy. And of course, the Navy denies that the Eldridge ever took part in experiments like we described. They say that never happened. They never denied the existence of the Eldridge. They apparently have never denied the existence of the USS Fog, DE-076. It took place as part of the Philadelphia experiment series, not in Philadelphia Harbor, but in Norfolk, Virginia Navy Yard in the same time frame. Whether it's the same day or not, I don't know. But the reports I get from the son of one of the sailors who was on board the Fog in that period of time, his father insisted, and his son said directly to me, and I have it in writing in a letter from him, that the Fog, when it was put under test and the equipment turned on, disappeared from the harbor of Norfolk, Virginia Navy Yard, appeared in the yard known as the Philadelphia Navy Yard for a period of time, and then returned to the yard in Norfolk, Virginia. And he swears up and down, that is his father did, that this actually happened. He was on board when it happened and he saw it. Now, a testimony like that, I'm not inclined to doubt it. But in terms of the Eldridge, the same claims have been made over a period of years that it disappeared from the Philadelphia Navy Yard, appeared at Norfolk, Virginia Navy Yard, and then reappeared in Philadelphia. Now, this would be on the second test and prior to its total disappearance. I have no proof of the statements about the Eldridge. I've never been able to find anyone who was actually witness to this happening or was on board the ship and saw it reappear at the Norfolk, Virginia Navy Yard. I'm not discrediting it, saying it could not have happened, but I have no proof whatever that it did happen. But what did happen that is of record to the Eldridge is something else. And I might add, there was a third ship involved in these tests, the DE-013, name unknown to me right now. And it was tested out in the Azores, truly at sea. And it sank with all hands. As far as I know, the Navy never attempted to salvage the ship. Now, why the ship in the Azores sank, I have no idea. There's been some strange stories and rumors, and of course, the only one that is really well known is the one of the Eldridge. Now, to go back to the Eldridge and the aftermath, that is immediately after the tests were over, and it was for some time sitting at dockside, and then, of course, disappeared out to sea in the normal sea service. Mr. Schneider, that is Captain Schneider, wrote a series of letters to various people in and out of the Navy regarding the whole event of the Eldridge. I'm going to show these letters on the screen here. But understand that this is of a ship which allegedly never took part in anything like the Philadelphia experiment. But here is the chief medical officer describing the problems. The fourth and last letter is the most interesting of all. How I acquired these is very interesting. It came from Phil Schneider, his son. I will show the first one here. Will not attempt to read it through the back of the book. But he makes one error. Refers to DE-173 as a USS Ferrioseth. He did not do it after that. Ferrioseth was the commercial merchant ship. And it shows that there was a great problem regarding security.
Detail.
And that this was a great concern to him and a number of other people for a number of years. That was letter number 1, written on 12 December 1944, and as you may have noted, U.S. Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida, official Navy stationary for the non-existent test. Test number 2, letter number 2, 17 April 1953, is written again by Dr. Schneider, MD, to Lieutenant General Nathan F. Twining regarding the lack of precision in the search for artifacts aboard the Eldridge and trying to determine exactly what happened during the period of the test and its aftermath. You will probably have noted in reading this that on 21 April 1953, J. Edgar Hoover got into the act requiring maximum security and personnel evaluation of psychological unit at Quantico, Virginia. Quantico, of course, being a Navy and Marine base. Letter number 3, 23 April 1953, just a few days after the third one, to Dr. E.U. Condon, regarding, again, the whole problem with the Eldridge and Hoover's involvement and so forth. And this is another rather interesting letter. The fourth and final letter is the most interesting one of all. This one is written to a superior in the Navy's medical department, a man by the name of Farnborough, MD, on a rhyolite section coding. And the date on this is 6 March 1955, when one of the sailors died, crew member number 9. They did an autopsy. And in the process of this autopsy, he found a strange object buried in the guy's brain, which he shows an illustration of, approximately 1.25 inches long, 1/4 inch in diameter, metal tip with some very strange coded markings on it, which are not normal English or normal Earth language, apparently. He had no idea what it was. He said it appears to be an implant, and it was in his brain. I emphasize that because even today, we cannot implant an object like this in a human brain and have the person survive. But there it was. It had been there for quite some period of time, along with 3 others. He notes the fact that there were 4 implants in this one person's body. What is it? Do you have any idea? He asked the superior on the surface.
Whoa. That's not human. That's how legit.
This last letter was, I think, the most important of them all because it answers a question which I had had in my mind for many years, and at the time, right after the experiments, that number 1 and number 2, especially number 2, were completed, there were rumors among the sailors, while the ship was in hyperspace, that something very strange happened, and there were extraterrestrials running around on board the ship on the deck. Apparently those below deck, no one ever reported any such incidents, but those who survived on deck did report strange incidents. I dismissed them. I didn't believe them. But after reading these letters, as Al Bielek, because I've never saw them until a few years ago, it now answers that question. Were there extraterrestrials on board the Eldridge in more than hyperspace? The answer appears to be yes. Because those objects were not something we had any technology whatever to replicate at the time of 1943. And implants at that time were unknown. Now, what actually happened? I told you what happened on the outside. And in that period of time, as noted by people watching the Eldridge disappear and reappear, and then I gave my testimony. Now, what was my testimony? At this point, it gets perhaps a little bizarre to the ideas of some people, but it needs to go into the record. On the inside of the ship, where Duncan and I were running the equipment for this test on 12 August 43, on command, we turned everything on. Everything seemed to be working, functioning in a totally normal manner, and we didn't notice anything unusual for about 30 seconds. Then things started to happen. At that point, we've got a very strange phenomenon appear in the control room, which appeared like high voltage arc over some equipment. There was no high voltage equipment in that compartment. Therefore, it was all the more strange to us because while it resembled high voltage arc overs, there was no high voltage equipment. It was in multiple colors too, by the way, which would follow some types of high voltage discharge. And we tried to get someone on the radio. The radio had nothing but static on it. So we didn't know at that point what to do. We had no one on the outside to give us instructions, so we were on our own. And of course, we had been instructed. If you are on your own, if something goes wrong, it's up to you to make the judgments as to what to do. If you have to, shut the equipment down. So that's what we attempted to do. We found that the main control handles for the AC power coming out of the very large 8 megawatt alternator, diesel electric, we could not budge them. They were frozen in place. As conditions started to get worse and other conditions started to show, namely of the 3006L6 tubes, which drove the...
Now, this is huge, guys. This is, you may wonder, like, what does this have to do with Mr. Metaphysical? What does anything like, why do I care about this? I remember I was speaking with a girl who was doing a World War II project, and I told her to use this as a resource, and she just couldn't get with it, college student. And I looked at the resources that were given her. I was like, you're only using the resources they tell you are official. How do you, these lives count? What do you mean? Like, these aren't, so it's like, you guys always, I say the highest measure of intelligence is open-mindedness. It actually hurt my feelings because this girl was really intelligent. So I realized that there's a limit to the intelligence. But I mean, I don't know. I think everything in due time, to be honest. Like, I'm not saying she can't come around and see this or something like that. But what I'm saying is, basically, this has everything to do with the metaphysical. Not only are they going into hyperspace, doing stuff beyond the physical, but meta meaning beyond than the physical. Hey guys, when you see my name Meta on here, it's my nickname. People always call me Mr. Meta, Mr. Metaphysical. Instead of calling me Mr. Metaphysical, go from Mr. Metaphysical to Mr. Meta to just Meta. Not to be confused with the technology company Meta. And I was even being called Meta before they even changed their name. That's a whole nother thing if we want to get into it. Basically, so if you look at the Cryon entity, Kryon, Cryon, channeled by Lee Carroll, maybe I could feature some videos when he's saying this. And that's kind of my goals. This is the first layer of getting all these videos together. And then like maybe later I'll put them all together and splice it to where right after this, you'll see him talking. But he says that this time period, especially the atomic bomb, was a roll call. Hey, we're here for planet Earth to the rest of creation, because we blow up our planet and it affects their planets. But not only to the rest of creation, just inside our solar system that revolves around the sun, but inside the other solar systems, as we know the word solar systems to mean. So this is very huge, this time period, what the things he's talking about, because it's announcing to the other aliens like our planet. And what Cryon said, separate from Lee Carroll, is separate from Al Bielek, is that our planet was hidden because most solar systems have two suns for life to be sustained within that solar system. But our solar system only has one sun, which is a whole other debate we're going to get into later on as we start looking into Saturn and its meaning. And it's crazy. It's crazy. It's crazy. It's crazy. Okay. And guys, this is actually why I'm covering this during the daytime too, and not just doing late night, because there's so much to cover. I'll probably be doing this all day.
The field coils of the two alternators, the standard old-fashioned glass bulb type, stand about this high. The smaller ones have been built since, but they were about that high. And I'm sure anyone who knows any of the electronics around the beginning years, the 30s, 40s, and the beginning years after the war, knows what a glass envelope 6L6 looks like. They get rather hot. They have a very pleasant glow to them from the heater or the filament inside the cathode. With 3,000 of them, you generate quite a bit of light and quite a lot of heat. That's one of the problems keeping that compartment cool. But they started to glow in a very strange manner, and they started to waver. Instead of it being a constant level of illumination, which is to be expected, they got brighter, and then they got weaker, and they were doing a fluctuation type of thing in terms of the illumination level. We consider this as very abnormal, because we've never seen a phenomenon like this before, and the amount of power involved, there's 3,000 of these in terms of heater power, was quite sizable. And with the high voltage arc over and the inability to shut the equipment off, we decided it was time to get out of there. Ran out opened the bulkhead door, ran out on deck, saw sailors milling around, but again, did not see anything abnormal. We went for the railing. We both had the same idea at the same time. Let's jump overboard and swim ashore. There's nothing we can do. Everything appeared normal to the ship, up to the railing and slightly beyond. But a short distance beyond the railing, there was nothing but a solid gray fog. And we didn't think anything about that. We said, let's jump overboard, and we did. I mean, we didn't say this verbally. This was, shall we say, simultaneous mental thinking. We jumped overboard. We never hit the water. We were good swimmers. We weren't worried about the height.
It didn't hit water.
Never hit the water. We started to fall. The sensation was like falling down an elevator shaft with no bottom.
Gosh.
And down we went. And down we went. And suddenly, we were, shall we say, perhaps panic-stricken. We didn't have enough time to worry about being panic-stricken, but we were totally dismayed. We had.
Okay, guys, really start to, if you've been here this long, stay, because it's really starting to cook at this point. You got to, let's go through the kind of boring stuff to get to here. I'm going to rewind it 30 seconds.
Again, did not see anything abnormal. We went for the railing. We both had the same idea at the same time. Let's jump overboard and swim ashore. There's nothing we can do. Everything appeared normal to the ship, up to the railing and slightly beyond. But a short distance beyond the railing, there was nothing but a solid gray fog. And we didn't think anything about that. We said, let's jump overboard, and we did. I mean, we didn't say this verbally. This was, shall we say, simultaneous mental thinking. We jumped overboard. We never hit the water. We were good swimmers. We weren't worried about the height. Never hit the water. We started to fall. The sensation was like falling down an elevator shaft with no bottom. And down we went, and down we went. And suddenly, we were, shall we say, perhaps panic-stricken. We didn't have enough time to worry about being panic-stricken, but we were totally dismayed. We had not the slightest idea what was going on. We were more or less side by side. And this went on until what we estimate was about 2 minutes later. We arrived at a very strange location. At night, standing upright, next to a chain link fence. And it was dark. We didn't know where we were, but we knew it was a military base in all likelihood because the chain link fence was of a military design. At that point, very suddenly, a very bright spotlight beamed down on us, illuminated us very brightly. And we wondered what that was. Well, we knew what searchlights were, but it was on a helicopter, and helicopters were unknown to us because in 1943 there were very few. They were experimental. But as it turned out, this was a production-type helicopter, as we learned later. But MPs came out of someplace and grabbed us and took us to a building. In the building, on an elevator, down the elevator shaft, the door opens. We see a lot of military personnel and a very elderly civilian in a gray business suit, white hair, what was left of it on the side of his head, walking towards us. He looks at us and says, "Gentlemen, I've been expecting you. Now, Dr. John Von Neumann." So we look at him. He says, "You're who?" And I says, "I'm Dr. John Von Neumann." Couldn't be. We left him approximately an hour or so ago. And he's a much younger man. Couldn't be you. He looked at us rather sternly and says, "Gentlemen, this is not 1943. This is 1983. I am the same Dr. Von Neumann you knew in 1943, except I'm 40 years older.
My goodness.
Welcome to the Montauk Air Force Station," or words to that effect. We didn't know whether to believe him or not. We didn't know what was going on. And he took us for a cook's tour. Well, this tour included IBM 360 and 370 computers, tape recorders, all of the paraphernalia of a 360 and 370, disk drives, visual displays, which were special for the facility, and all of this, and many other pieces of unknown to us electronic equipment. And then, of course, after this little tour, we happened to go past a room where there was a large screen color television set and display, operational. We came back to that later, but he took us all over, and as it became dawn, he took us upstairs and let us look around the base. We never were taken off base. They let us sit down and relax a bit and says, "Why don't you watch TV for a while?" So we did. Now, from the standpoint of 1943, where you had only 10-inch black and white color television sets, the more standard chassis being the RCA 630TS, which any of the older aficionados will know. I worked on many of them afterwards. That was all it was then in 43. But here we're looking at large screen color TV, a 27-inch type or something like that. Good sound, color, And of course, we watched some of the news shows and other things, and it showed traffic jams on the freeways. What was a freeway? There weren't any in 43, except the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which is the first in the country. And advertising, which made no sense to us, but what really finally got to us and convinced us that maybe the old man was right, was an ad by, I believe it was American Airlines, saying, in essence, to those listening to the ad, on your next vacation trip to Hawaii, why not fly with us in our 747 jet? Well, of course. Now, if you think we might have been confused at this point, you're absolutely right.
Well, he was going to say, because I've seen this on other channels on this channel, he's like, we didn't have those jets in 19 where I came from, 1939, 1940s, 747s. We didn't have those.
To take it back a little bit, all through the period of when we were working on the equipment for the test, we didn't know whether it was going to work properly or not before the first test with the Eldridge, though the prior equipment in 1940 worked very well, but it was a different design and a much lower power. In the first test, everything went well, and we didn't fully believe that it would work, but it did. The second test, we had a fairly good idea it was probably going to work, but we had just prior to this test for 3 days, that is starting approximately 9 August, this terrible queasy feeling in our stomach, which I previously mentioned. And we simply didn't know what was...
For those of y'all who think he's lying, look how the quote-unquote lies stack up and come back to each other and make sense. They loop, and this guy's telling the truth.
Coming down, we felt something was wrong. But up to the point where we emerged at what we were told was Montauk Air Force Station at Montauk, Long Island, we didn't really know that there was something wrong. We didn't have time to think about it as we went falling through this tunnel, if you will. Then we arrive at the point and we are completely surprised, we were completely overwhelmed, and then we're taken to the underground facility. We're completely dumbfounded and totally disoriented is perhaps a mild word as to what we felt. Disoriented and completely flabbergasted because nothing fit anything that we knew. And then we sat down in front of a color TV. I mean, from 10-inch black and white to some 27-inch color TV, there's a bit of a jump for what was to us perhaps 10 minutes. 10 minutes in terms of the time reference. We were very, very confused at this point. Emotions are going through our heads and everything else, and we simply didn't know how to handle it, if you want to put it bluntly. We didn't know what to do about it. There wasn't anything we could do about it. But at this point, while we were discussing it among ourselves and quite thoroughly concerned, dismayed, whatever, John Van Neumann comes in again. Dr. Van Neumann says to us, gentlemen, we have a problem. I said, oh, okay. The ship, the Eldridge, locked up with experiments we're doing here at Montauk. And so the equipment is very similar, though it's more high-powered here. And the concepts under which we're operating are very similar to what the Eldridge did. They're both involving use of time and time equations and this sort of thing, which we understood. But he said the problem is that the Eldridge locked up with the station, and it was on the 12th of August of 1943 when the Eldridge was yanked out of the harbor and into hyperspace. We know it's there. The hyperspace bubble, which is considered artificial, actually is being fed by the generators aboard the Eldridge and is growing. We've got to shut it down, but there's no way we can do it. We can shut down our equipment here, but that bubble is being fed by the equipment aboard the Eldridge. And unless the fuel runs out before we estimate about 30 days, or equipment breaks down, this thing can keep running for 30 days, and that bubble will grow, and we don't know how big it may get. He said, theoretically, it could engulf the Earth. We can't have this happen. You have to go back there and shut the equipment down. And I looked at John, and I says, are you trying to tell us that we're going to go back to the Eldridge, and we don't even know how we got here in the first place? And he says, there is no problem, gentlemen. He says, here at Montauk, we have complete control over space and time. We can send you anywhere as we want at any time we want. That, of course, is referring...
Guys, that's 40 years ago. It's 2024. That's 1984, I think he said. So that's a math may be off. Sorry if I'm really anyway. But that's dang near 40 years ago, 30 years ago. So let's continue.
Referring to the functions of the Montauk Project, which I'll get into later. But true to their word, they sent us back to the decks of the Eldridge, and they put us in radiation suits, something similar to what you see on the various shows today and the sci-fi shows, and what, of course, the astronauts have worn out in space.
So there is a movie about this you can watch that he talks about, the Philadelphia experiment. There's a movie.
And sent us back to the decks of the Eldridge. Now, what they did, we didn't understand, except we stood by an opening in the wall, and we were sucked into it, and we wound up in the decks of the Eldridge. This was, of course, the Montauk Time Tunnel, which I will go into at length later. We arrived in the decks of the Eldridge, take off our helmets.
Hey, this becomes very, very, very important. This may be included, of course, Intro to Meta World. This is huge. They stood by a wall, and they were sucked into it. He said, which I'll go into later. He calls them tunnels, Montauk tunnels. We're going to learn, this is used for connecting information, like connecting the dots. We're going to learn, and you just go, it's just the rabbit hole just gets deeper, y'all. So it's like, we're going to learn that, one, aliens have the same technology. If you start peering around on YouTube enough, you'll hear the connection. Some of the sources I've asked not to be used for different reasons. I'll tell you, go watch Alba Wyman's YouTube station, ALBA, and then Wyman, WEINMAN. But I can't tell you exactly which one because she does. Those are personal hypnosis sessions, and she doesn't want those sources being used in situations like this. But yeah, guys, and then also in the Wingmakers text, you'll see I did an interview recently with Isis I, Extended Knowledge. She doesn't even know that she was talking about Al Bielek. This is part of what she's talking about. She's like, no, she's not here yet. She said she saw a vision where she has like first person, so she sees it out of the person's eyes. So she said she was like she was him, and she was recounting it with us in the memory. She actually did this live in our group. It was me, her, Zach, Maze Love, Mary. Well, anyway, so Greg. It was I think it was like a Thursday, if I don't remember. So I'm sorry I didn't have that recorded, but she said that she opens a door as him, and all of a sudden she found herself on Mars. And she said, like, apparently there's tunnels all throughout our planet where we're extended, and we could travel to other planets just from our planet alone. Guys, I know I heard this before. When I heard it, I thought it was crazy. Here we go. Let's get into it. Let's go.
Instructions were smash the equipment, destroy it, whatever you have to do to shut it down. It didn't matter. We arrived back on the decks. We see sailors milling all over the place, obviously quite distraught. We went in the control room. We found axes and started smashing everything in sight with axes. Insulated gloves in our hands, of course. That was part of the suit. So if glass flew or high voltage arced out at us, well, at least we were protected. After we smashed enough equipment, of course, particularly that equipment which was driving the field coils of the two big alternators and all the control functions for the alternator, they started to wind down. Now, they're very massive, and of course we knew it would take 2 or 3 minutes before they wound down totally. They might be putting out field energy in the meantime. That is energy to the field of the torque coils on the deck. So when this was done, we went out on the deck. We figured it's over. At that point, we saw 2 sailors buried in the steel deck, 2 more buried upright, standing upright in bulkheads. One of them, my younger brother, Jim, who was in the process, as the other 3, of dying. The 5th man had his hand in a steel bulkhead. He wasn't dying, and he lived. They cut his hand off at the wrist and gave him an artificial hand. Others to the others.
Crazy.
It was a very, very sad and tragic thing to see them. We could do nothing whatever about what was happening to them. Because what do you do if a body, as the later examination showed, what do you do if a body is completely embedded in the steel and the steel molecules are embedded in the physical body? In other words, the molecules of flesh are mixed and intermingled with the molecules of steel. Something we had never seen before, we've never heard of before, and hopefully nobody's ever seen since. But that was what happened on the Eldridge, and of course, at a later date, those bodies were removed. But at that particular point, one of them, Jim, was still quite conscious. I walked over to him, put my arms around him. Duncan, in the meantime, took one look at this scenario, which there were other sailors running around totally crazy. Some were fading in and out of reality, or that is what appeared to be happening. Duncan heads to the rail, looks at me, and like, aren't you coming along? I wasn't about to because I was trying to comfort Jim. He jumped over the rail and disappeared. He was no longer in the reality of 1943.
Remember, he was trying to comfort Jim, his youngest brother. He just brought that up 20 minutes ago. So this is what. So apparently, this is when they went back after from 1980 to that time to the experiment. With Dr. John von Neumann sends him back. He taken over for Tesla. Dr. John von Neumann. He becomes very important and instrumental in Al Bielek's life because he promised him in the 2000s or 90s, said, if you ever remember your identity as Ed Cameron, I'll come back and I'll come to you. And he did. And this is crazy. These people have control over all time and space. It's crazy. Top secret.
Of course, at that exact point, he wasn't in 1943 either, because the ship was not yet fully returned to that point in the harbor from which it had left, 12 August 1943. Shortly after that, the fog cleared, and we saw the harbor and everything like it had been. And then, of course, the other observer ships, primarily the Perrier, and then the boarding party came. They were rather dismayed themselves to see what had happened. And the rest is more or less history, is what I have said. The Eldridge with another boarding party was returned to from the harbor to the Navy Yard, and then, of course, the Board of Inquiry. I gave my report about being in the future in 1983, seeing Dr. John von Neumann, and the public record, he died of cancer in 1957. He did not die of cancer. He was very much alive in 1983 and was very much alive for many years after that. As far as I know, he's still alive as of this moment, because I visited with him about 2 years ago, upstate New York, where his current home is. But there we had a situation. The Navy couldn't understand what happened. Nobody really understood fully what happened. Dr. John von Neumann had a good grasp of it. When all of the reports were done and a file was generated, they decided, of course, the Eldridge should be re-outfitted. As to what happened to myself and Duncan, Duncan was never seen again in the Navy Yard. He was never seen again in that time frame, as we found out much later. Research by myself as Al Bielek in the late 80s turned up the fact that Duncan had returned after jumping over off the ship to the Montauk Project sometime in the 80s, that is the early 80s, and was part of the project there. And after an accident, which very little is known precisely what happened, he started to, as we call it, he lost his time locks, and he started to age at a very rapid rate, about 1 year per hour. This led to another phenomena. They didn't know how to stop it. And there are some things in biology and body functions which even today, a few years after that, is still not fully understood. They couldn't reverse his aging and stop it. So again, Montauk to the rescue, if I may put it that way. They sent back someone to father in the 50s, actually the late 40s, and said, get busy and make another son. Duncan's dying, and we can't allow this. Why they can't allow it, I'll get into in a little bit. It has to do with this whole time loop problem. So father remarried. There was his fifth wife. The first sister was born, Duncan's current sister. And later on, Duncan was born June 28th, 1951. That is the Duncan we know today. And he has a slight resemblance to the old Duncan.
Pay attention. This gets confusing. So I'm going to rewind it 30 seconds because he talks about time locks, things that we don't understand, especially if you're hearing this for the first time. I'll let you rewind it. That's right. You have the power to rewind. So you can rewind from this point if you don't understand, like 30 seconds or 60 seconds of your own time.
But his characteristics are essentially the same. And he grew up, went through school, never went to college, joined the Air Force. He was in Vietnam and eventually was injured and was mustered out of the Air Force and wound up as part of the Montauk Project again as the current Duncan. Duncan number 2, if I may call him that. And that's another part of the history, which we'll get into later, namely the entire Montauk Project as recorded and what that means. But going back to the time frame I was referring to, which is, again, the aftermath of the Philadelphia experiment, and Duncan disappeared. I, of course, was with the Navy in that period of 1943, and the Navy decided to shut down the project completely. They scrapped it, as I'd already mentioned. But I was there footloose. They didn't know what to do with me because they knew I knew too much about what had happened, and they didn't want me talking to everybody, so they kept me somewhat isolated. But then Dr. John von Neumann, to my rescue, he had been assigned to the atomic bomb project at Los Alamos, New Mexico, which was in the process of being built between July 43 and, let's say, October 43, an ongoing thing after that, of course. In October 43, John von Neumann first showed up at Los Alamos for the purpose of helping in the development of the atomic bomb. The staff, of course, had as the head of the project Dr. Oppenheimer. Others on staff, of course, were Dr. Edward Teller and quite a large number of people, Hans Bethe, et cetera, et cetera. John von Neumann as a consultant who was in and out. Along in the spring of 1944, John decided that he would like to have me up there to help him and assist in the project. So he suggested to the Navy that maybe they would like to send me up to Los Alamos, and the Navy was delighted with the idea because it would put me into the most secret facility in the United States at that time and get me out of the mainstream of the Navy and out of the mainstream of everything. So I was sent up there in July of 1944 with family. I might add, of course, that in October of 1943, I married my fiancée, and a son came along in February of 1944. Let us say I was a bit busy prior to the marriage. And son was born, and all of us moved up to Los Alamos. We were there from 44 to 47. That is July 4th, 47. I worked on the project in terms of writing reports, assisting John any way I could. And I was sort of a loose wheel, but at the same time, I was making contributions. The Navy was most interested in having me write reports, of course classified, of the history and the development of the atomic bomb when the bomb was developed and they had dropped it on Japan, and of course the war was over. And at that point, they didn't know whether the Los Alamos laboratories would be kept going or whether it would be closed down. There was discussion in both directions. Oppenheimer stayed on. He didn't know what would happen. Of course, history records that it was kept alive and, of course, has been long since greatly expanded. But in that time period, while I was there from 44 to 47, I got into quite a few discussions with Ed Teller, who had rather an acid attitude at times. And he was, of course, snuck out of Europe to become part of the bomb project by whatever group, or SS or whomever. This is no longer my father's domain. And he became part of the bomb project. And, of course, the bomb was developed. And when it was over, he, as a physicist, wanted to go ahead and develop in what he called the next phase, the hydrogen bomb. Instead of an explosion bomb, he wanted the equivalent of an implosion bomb. Fusion, of course, was the key word. Oppenheimer was against it. I was against it. And, of course, I had many arguments with Dr. Teller. I told Teller his math was not complete. It wasn't right. Not fully correct, that is. I didn't accuse him of being outright wrong. It wasn't. But he became very upset with my comments and said, we've got to build the bomb now. We don't know what new enemies we're going to have. We must have it in reserve, and so forth. He got nowhere with anyone. And he remained at the laboratory. Eventually, he got so upset with me that without any clout on his own, he had a few friends and contacted a few, and the next thing I know, I'm being considered for removal from the labs. On July 3rd, a meeting was held with 3 people. I will not go into all of whom they were, but Dr. Teller, of course, was number 1, and he wanted me removed. And there were 2 others, one of whom is now deceased, Dr. Vannevar Bush. So he can't say anything particularly, but he was not one who voted against me. He voted to drop the issue and not to remove me. The third party I shall not name publicly, not at this time, was the one who cast the deciding vote for my removal. On July 4th, this vote was cast on July 3rd of 1947. On July 4th, a holiday, the family and I were at a picnic. MPs, or I should say appropriately SPs, short patrol they used to call them, drove up in the bus, identified me formally, arrested me, charging me with espionage, and took me away from the picnic, never to see the family again until in the 50s. And on a bus to a train to Washington, D.C. I expected a full court martial. We got down there, they said, no, the charges are dropped. And thinking about it since then, it was a ploy just to get me out of there. The Navy didn't want me really court-martialed because I hadn't done anything wrong. But the political pressure was such that they had to get me out and they had to have an excuse. So they charged me with espionage and then dropped the charges. So I was stationed at the Pentagon at that point, and they told me, we have a new assignment for you. Okay, fine. Where's my family? Well, you can't see the family. So I was sent to Muroc Drive Base is what it was called then. We're now called Edwards Air Force Base. In July of 1947 to be an official observer for the Mach 1 project. The Mach 1 project, for those who may not know what it is, because it did happen quite a few years ago, was the attempt to break the sound barrier. Bell Aircraft Company built a rocket plane called the X-1, and there were follow-on models, XS-1, etc. And this project took place at Edwards, now Edwards, then Muroc Dry Lake Base. And the whole purpose was to see if you could get a plane to fly faster than sound. The military took the view that let's try it. The mathematicians and the scientists, pardon the expression, didn't think it was possible. They were clearly convinced it was impossible. You can't fly faster than the speed of sound. Well, needless to say, we've been doing it for decades. But that was the first attempt, and it was successful. Among the people who were there on staff as part of the actual test group was, of course, Chuck Yeager, who was a principal pilot. He was not in NASA then. There was no NASA yet. And his principal aeronautical engineer consultant, Jack Ridley. I was there as observer, along with 11 others. There were 10 from the U.S., and 2 from foreign sources. One was Italian, the other was German. I do not know why they were there. I know why the American ones were there, of course. The Navy was very interested in the outcome because if it was successful, they wanted to go into a project of their own. The tests were successful on 28 October 1947. And with that, of course, the Navy decided they wanted to build a project of their own. The project was not terminated. It went into a new phase, and it continued on the research. But in the process of being there, I met, of course, Jack Ridley. Yeager I knew casually, but Ridley and I had something in common. We both had physics degrees. He had a bachelor's degree from the University of Oklahoma, after which he joined the Army. He was transferred to the Army Air Corps, and at some point after that, for whatever reasons, the Army transferred him to Caltech, so he could get a master's degree in aeronautical engineering, and then eventually he was assigned to the Edwards operation. I met him, I talked with him at length, and we both discussed this. Well, rocket planes are fine. They put out plenty of power, but it doesn't last very long. If we get to space exploration at a later date, which we both were quite sure would happen, what do we use for propulsion power? Well, we kicked this around between us for quite a while. We were quite close about this, and we used to have a lot of meetings over beer and a lot of meetings otherwise. Neither of us, well, I was married, but I never did get to see the family. He was not married at that point. And we came up with an idea, a new one. How about an ion propulsion engine? We both knew physics, and we felt it could be done. So we went back to our principals, I to the Navy and he to the Air Force, which had come into being in the meantime. And they liked the idea. And they both said, if you want to get together, we'll finance a facility. Go find a place and build a facility where you can do your work and perhaps build an ion propulsion engine. We're very interested in this. So we found a location. It was in Malibu Beach, California. And we've had a small facility built there. And we moved in along with the staff about 1949. Very small staff, small operation. And we did a lot of research and a lot of testing. And this went on until 1953, when in March of 1953, I'm sorry, January 1953, we had our first successful test. There were a lot of failures. I'll make no mistake about it. It was a difficult project to get an engine to do what we wanted it to do. The test goal was 1,000 pounds thrust for at least 10 minutes. We exceeded that. We put out 1,200 pounds thrust for 20 minutes, at which point an ion feed failed, and we shut it down. I was ready to let it run all day if the system would work. It was a completely classified project, but I can tell you that the word got out like wildfire through the aircraft industry. Douglas and Long Beach was ecstatic. They wanted to work with us. They had something in mind. Martin Aircraft in Baltimore, Maryland, was quite gruff about it with no comment. Boeing hit the roof, and they were very upset about it, which to me said at the time that they had a system of their own in their skunk works, and we beat them to the draw. Shortly after this test, father, my natural father, Alexander Duncan Cameron Sr., shows up and says, I've heard about your work. Incorporate. I am ready to fund you with unlimited funds so we can get this thing off the ground. He says, if you can get it rolling, he says, it will be a major industry. That was his statement. I said, fine. So we filed corporate papers, incorporated. We started to file patents. And in March of 1953, Jack went out on a business trip for a week. And during that period of time, I was there essentially alone, holding down the fort along with a small staff. What happened from that point on was very interesting. One day during the middle of that week, a team of Black Ops personnel, very similar to Delta Force and some of the other special groups. For those who know the military know there is a Black Ops operation. A team of Black Ops people, 7 of them, came in, grabbed me out from under the nose of everybody else, took me out, and went on a plane to Washington, D.C., and then we went to McLean, Virginia, where there's a joint NSA-CIA facility. And from that point on, things got very interesting. Once in this facility, I was interrogated by a very strange and interesting group of people who, believe it or not, interrogated me for over 3 days, and I could not understand what it was all about or why at first. They wanted to know practically my life history, and I thought that was strange because, after all, it was essentially an open book with the Navy. The Navy personnel knew what I had done, where I'd been. But nevertheless, I had all these questions thrown at me of what I had done in the Navy. Got into the Philadelphia experiment and all of this, and in some detail, and they were interested in that. But then, well, how did you get involved in this project? I said, I met Jack Ridley, and we decided that the thing to do is build an ion propulsion engine. He says, yes, we know about that you had a successful test. But where does it go from here? I said, well, that's what I want to know. We expect to go into production with this thing after we iron out some wrinkles. We've already been promised all kinds of money, and then we have incorporated. Now, what's the problem? Well, I was told at that point that there was a group, which I had heard rumblings about already, called the Cristaldi Research Group, who were very interested in this project and quite interested probably in taking it over. Now, we were running, by the way, under the name of JRC Enterprise. Enterprises, which JR stood for Jack Ridley, C for Cameron, and E for Edward. JRC Enterprises, if one wants to check and has the capability of finding the right location on the internet, still exists as a wholly owned subsidiary of Cristaldi Research Group. At that point, I didn't ask very much about Cristaldi. I knew of them, and they knew they were interested, and it was made apparent to me that Cristaldi was going to take over the operation. I did not say that in so many words in this meeting, but they made that quite apparent. It was obvious that I was to be frozen out, and I was. They told me I would not be returned to the facility. I was returned to the Pentagon, at which point I was rather upset and rather hopping mad and wanted to know from my superiors just what is going on here. Why can't I go back? They wouldn't give me an answer at first. They wouldn't give me any answers. And I remained stationed there on payroll. And weeks went by and months went by, and I kept asking questions. I wasn't doing anything useful. I was a bump on a log sitting in an office, passing the time of day, trying to find out what the history was going to be. In the meantime, Jack Ridley came back from his business trip and found I was missing, and he couldn't understand what it was all about, and the people there could not give him a very adequate explanation. And so he tried to carry on his own. I don't know at this point whether he thought I walked out or whether I was kidnapped or what. The report should have been that I was literally kidnapped. But I remained at the Pentagon. I was not even able to call him. And as time went by, I kept asking questions, went further and further up the line, finally to the Joint Chiefs. What is going on here is that I want to get back and do some work in the Navy and basically a career man. I'd like to see my family and so forth. They all demurred. I finally went to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and I asked him, I said, what is going on? Gave my same story and so forth. And he looked at me rather strangely, and he says, there is nothing I can do, quote, it is out of my hands, unquote. I knew then something was very, very strange going on. And with him saying it was out of their hands, meaning out of the hands of the military, I had no idea what was really afoot. Late July, I got a word that a decision had been made, and that in August, I was going to be sent back to Montauk. I said, Montauk? Montauk Point. No, there was such a place. I didn't know much about it. There was a Fort Hero and a military base there, which at that point was Montauk Air Force Station. They were doing radar research. That I knew about, or as the beginning phases of it. So I was sent there and told to stand in a certain location in the traffic circle. And next thing I know, I'm back at Montauk. Underground, 1983. What specific date in 83, I don't know. I wasn't there very long. But I was met by a number of people at this location. As time went by, I kept asking questions, went further and further up the line, finally to the Joint Chiefs. What is going on here is that I want to get back and do some work in the Navy and basically a career man. I'd like to see my family and so forth. They all demurred. I finally went to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and I asked him, I said, what is going on? Gave my same story and so forth. And he looked at me rather strangely, and he says, there is nothing I can do, quote, it is out of my hands, unquote. I knew then something was very, very strange going on. And with him saying it was out of their hands, meaning out of the hands of the military, I had no idea what was really afoot. Late July, I got a word that a decision had been made, and that in August, I was going to be sent back to Montauk. And I said, Montauk? Montauk Point. No, there was such a place. I didn't know much about it. There was a Fort Hero and a military base there, which at that point was Montauk Air Force Station. They were doing radar research. That I knew about, or as the beginning phases of it. So So I was sent there and told to stand in a certain location in the traffic circle. And next thing I know, I'm back at Montauk Underground, 1983. What specific date in 83, I don't know. I wasn't there very long. But I was met by a number of people at this location, Underground, Dr. John Von Neumann being the principal. And here we were in the middle of Montauk Underground in New York State, actually on the very eastern tip of Long Island. And John tells me, he says, I don't like what they're going to do to you. He says, I have no control over this anymore. He said, I'm now only a consultant on the base. This was in sometime in 83, and I don't know exactly when. He says, what they're going to do is strip you completely of your memories, and with special equipment we have here. He made some passing comment that it was something they captured after the war from the Germans. So they're going to age regress you down to a young kid, and they're going to put you in another family in the past and hope you never remember anything. I says, they're going to do what? And he says, this is what they're going to do. Well, they physically grabbed me, put me on a gurney, gave me a shot of some kind, and then put me in a very strange machine, if you will. I was on a standard-sized medical gurney, typically about that wide, but I was shoved in a tube, which was like glass, it was transparent, approximately this wide with the inner wall. And then there was an outer wall like this, and in between there were 4 coils, flat ribbon coils of wire, truly ribbon, not wire, with connections to each end of them for all 4 coils. But I observed the fact that the connecting cables went over to some piece of equipment that lined up in the wall, which covered all of one wall. I was looked at it. It was black panels. It had very strange, ancient-looking markings on it, with little marking tabs above it in English, saying what these controls were for. And the glowing behind the panel, which side panel was removed so I could see it, was some modern type transmitting tubes, basically of the type that writes on the color, or something very similar, about 10 or 20 kW each, of that genre. Well, I had that shot, then I had another one, and I passed out, slowly fading out in a reverie, if you will. And then the next thing I remembered, I was at my current legal mother's, now deceased at this point, the Bielek family, having a Christmas party in Christmas 1927. And there I was, I very clearly remember, and it's the only, this year, earliest memory I have, it's the only one I have of that particular period. I have no memory of being in a baby carriage. I have no memory of doing this sort of thing. Like this current, I mean, I did have a crib, but at this Christmas party, there was a small Christmas tree on the table, on the top of Mother's grand piano, mahogany thing, about this high. And I was a little shorter than this, as would be expected. It was approximately a 9-month-old baby. So I was watching all of this and listening to what was going on with all of the people whom I later identified as the regular relatives associated with the Bielek family, understanding virtually everything they said. Understand what I'm saying. I understood the English and everything they were saying, and I was less than 1 year old. What 1-year-old baby understands the English language, particularly of adults, talking in normal conversation? I did. Major discrepancy number 1, which of course I could not resolve for many years. And a few phrases dropped out. I did not understand what was being said, but virtually everything, 80% or better, was understandable. Well, from that point, I grew up as Al Bielek, not knowing any different, not knowing any better. Went through my childhood years. Went to grade school. Parents moved. They were at that point living in Jamaica, Long Island. They moved from there to Paterson, New Jersey. From Paterson, New Jersey, they moved to Long Island. They ran a business on Long Island for a period of time, which failed. And from there, they moved in with my grandparents, that is my legal mother's father and his wife, in Foster Avenue in Brooklyn. I was there from 33 to 1938 when we moved to New Jersey. So I grew up not knowing anything else, all of the usual childhood things. Another discrepancy. At the age of 12, I was 6'1" and totally out of proportion. I was all legs. At that point, my shoulder width, was no wider than my hips, which is more than a little bit unusual, but that was the case. But since I left the Bielek family and was out on my own, many of the physical discrepancies have changed. My eyesight was bad from the age of about 6.5 on. I had to wear glasses, rather heavy, to go through school. Finished my high school. I was drafted into the Navy. That was in July 1945. I wound up as an electronic technician. I thought that was rather strange and ironic in a way, and looking at it later. Went through the Navy for a year, and then the war was over, and they sort of twisted our arm to stay in the Navy for at least another year. I refused to do it. We were not under compulsion to do it, and we were not under compulsion to join the reserves at that time. Approximately a year and a half later, it was mandatory to become a reservist, which of course pulled a few friends of mine back in the time period of the Korean War. I kept growing up. I went through school. I went to try a business of my own for a number of years. Between the period of roughly 1947 and 1951, it didn't go well. This was in New Jersey. I went to college in NCE, Newark College of Engineering, Newark, New Jersey. And in 1953, I got the notion, I'm fed up with this living in New Jersey with my folks. I'm moving to California. I was after I had a job for a year and a half with a rather interesting company on the East Coast. There was a field engineer for an electronics firm that supplied flight simulators for the Air Force and other organizations, both commercial and military. Went to California, continued there, continued my schooling. Eventually wound up as a consulting electronic engineer. That started in 1958 and went on for 30 years to 1988 when I retired from the engineering profession. Not absolute and total, but that was the way it worked. It wasn't as I wanted to, but that's the way it happened. In that period of time, of course, I met a number of interesting people like Ivan T. Sanderson, and I had picked up a few magazines dealing with the Philadelphia experiment and Einstein's connection with it. And I had an absolute fascination with the subject during this period. And the fascination had become virtually a compulsion before long to find any information I could whatsoever about the subject. I became acquainted with Ivan T. Sanderson, who was a British naturalist and moved to New York just prior to the end of World War II. And I met him in 1951. I dropped association in 1953 because of my travels with the company as a flight simulator specialist. And in 1963, I recontacted him while I was in Pennsylvania and became reacquainted, and then I was on his staff. He also had a great interest in the Philadelphia experiment, and since he had been in intelligence, British intelligence, was sort of a special guest, if you will, in the Pentagon almost any time he wanted to go down there and talk with the intelligence people and other officers in the Navy. And they tossed around a lot of subjects. UFOs was common gossip at that time, well recognized and accepted by the military, but not for the outside public's consumption, totally internal. And he couldn't find anything out about the Philadelphia experiment. He was certain that something had happened. The only thing the Navy would admit to him was a DE-17 173 and others. They wouldn't say more than that. Of course, it was in the records that there was a DE 173, commissioned on 27 August 1943, served in the war, and everything else which I've said about it since when it went to the Greeks. But, of course, at that point, nothing about it coming back. And he couldn't find out a thing. I couldn't find anything out, but my interest remained. A series of books were written after that, starting in 1978. The first one was entitled Thin Air by two authors whom I do not know who they are. It was a fiction story, basically, but the background information they gave regarding the Philadelphia experiment was quite accurate. Speaking in retrospect, they mentioned the man who was a scientist who gave them all the information to write the book, a man they called Dr. Reno, R-E-N-O. No connection with Janet Reno. And described the house and the factory of cats, and the place was a total dismayed wreck, all of which was absolutely correct fact. And then, of course, came the next book, next year, 1979, The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility by Berlitz and Moore. Now, Moore never got his facts straight, but there's one or two things in there which did hang together. And again, the mention of Dr. Reno, describing the same location, that this is the source of much of their information. Except obviously they didn't get enough of correct information from Dr. Reno, who turns out to be Dr. John von Neumann. That, of course, took quite a bit of detective work and quite some time to find out. Well, I went on my merry way, and in I was a member, of course, since this is of importance, of the USPA, United States Psychotronics Association, originally in its founding year in 1975 called the U.S. Radionics Association, but they changed it the next year because of the connotation of radionics and the somewhat bad taste it had in the mouth of scientists and some other people. They renamed it the Psychotronics Association. I was a founding member, and of course the thing is not defunct. It's in limbo today. It's not what it was, but they still have meetings. Through that organization and its annual meetings, I met Preston Nichols. And Preston Nichols at that time, this was 1981, was probably still involved in the Montauk Project, of which I had no recall at the point of time I'm referring to. And sometime later, it was actually 83 I met him, not 81. And in 85, he was at another conference and meeting for the USPA, in which he brought a new assistant called Duncan Cameron. I knew nothing about Duncan at that point because I was still, shall I say, heavily under the weather of a very heavy brainwashing, both for the Philadelphia experiment and my involvement in the Montauk Project. And I might add, for many other projects. Well, I saw Preston there. He gave a paper in 85, and Duncan was part of that presentation. And I saw a person I considered a psychic sensitive. I had a sort of feeling of kinship to him. I cornered him one day in the cafeteria of this facility where they're holding the meeting, which was in Dayton, Ohio. And we talked for about 2.5 hours. About halfway through this, I got this strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. I knew this guy from someplace. So I finally asked him, I says, Duncan, do you have any feeling, any idea that possibly you know me from somewhere? He said, yes. I says, I do. I says, from where? He says, I have no idea. And I said, I got the same feeling. I also have no idea where it's from, Before the meeting broke up and we left, Preston had invited me to come visit him sometime at his lab facility on Long Island. Now, this meeting was held in July of 1985, and I availed myself of his invite in August of 85, Duncan Cameron saying he would put me up at his house on Long Island, which is fairly close to where Preston lives. I still couldn't figure out where I knew him from, but I had the feeling, well, is it possible it's from a past life? Well, that was part of the answer, but that was not the real answer I was interested in. I won't go into all of the ideas about reincarnation. That's not part of this story, not part of this presentation and the facts which I'm trying to deal with. In August of 85, I went there, stayed at Duncan's place, intending to stay a weekend. I wound up staying 2 weeks. And on one of the visits with Preston, he says, I want to take you two out to a place on the eastern tip of Long Island. I'm not going to tell you what it's all about, but I know you two are sensitive. And I've been out there many times because I'm a surplus electronics dealer, but I know you guys hadn't been there before. Well, of course, that turned out to be the biggest joke of the century, but at that point, we didn't know it was any different. And he took us out in his truck, his car at that time. He had a van. Took us to the base, parked to the parking lot outside the base. The fences were down. It was totally deserted, and we wandered all over the place. And I could feel, as Duncan did, some horrendous projects had taken place there in the recent years and was obviously completely shut down, totally abandoned with wrecked equipment everywhere, unwrecked, completely intact electronic equipment in the buildings. The doors were unlocked. There was nobody to patrol the place, nobody looking after it. It was like somebody packed up and walked out and left this huge base with all this equipment on many, many military buildings behind. A huge power plant, this giant radar tower, and we couldn't figure it out. But we had the feeling that something terrible had happened there, and this was the key to what happened later. Terminated the visit, of course, and I went back to where I was living at that time, which was Phoenix, Arizona. I continued my employment and work, and eventually, in 1986, in the second visit, which was in May of 1986, after having talked with some friends in Phoenix, one of whom was a engineering minor at that point at ASU, that contacted me because of my interest in Tesla and some of Tesla's work. And he had a group of friends, the three of them, together. We talked. And I told him about my visit to Montauk Point and this huge installation. I said, we're totally abandoned. We're walking around it. He says, my guess was that somebody spent an enormous sum of money on this operation. My guess at that time was $50 billion, which wasn't too far off from the mark. Little did I know at that time that this guy, Lenny, full name Lenny Perlstein, was the nephew of Senator Barry Goldwater. Well, the story, of course, went to Goldwater. Goldwater was still a senator at that time. And he was also chairman of the Armed Services Oversight Committee. Well, he started looking through the records of Congress and the Senate to see if any money was spent on a project out there. He couldn't find anything. He got very frustrated. Of course, there was a military base that had been closed. It was closed in 1968 officially, and the state of New York was supposed to take the place over as a park. But little is known about the underground operations, and some of them above ground. But as our research proved later, this was all run on private money, a private group, and this was going back to 1947. This was, of course, in the period, speaking of overlapping my life as Al Bielek and Ed Cameron. When Operation Paperclip had been completed and all of the German scientists came into the U.S., they went to work at Brookhaven National Laboratories to continue projects they had been working on in Germany, namely time travel and also mind control. The mind control becomes a very interesting and very strong issue today, but I will go into it because it wasn't a strong issue at that time, but was one of the research programs. They were kicked out of Brookhaven in 1968 because somebody started reading their monthly reports, which are required of a tax-supported scientific institution. They looked for a new home. They found it at Montauk Point, the military people. They moved in. The military people, shortly after that, moved out for the most part, and they continued their operations, funded privately, without any government money. Therefore, there was no need for an oversight on the place. But of course, our dear intelligence people, not to berate them, CIA, NSA, ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence, DIA, all of them knew everything that was going on. And of course, they were working with the people who were there because there was another aspect to this, which the public has never learned, except in a few cases and instances. And very few people know about the Montauk research program out there at Montauk Point, unless you were part of it. And there are quite a few people around today who were part of it. That program